Hello, everyone. Good to be with you again. John Ortberg is a Christian pastor. He is an author, a very well-known public speaker. And in his book called The 10 Financial Commandments, he tells about trying to teach his kids the importance of money. And he refers in particular to a conversation he had with his daughter. He says this. He says, when our kids were little, we put them on the envelope system. When we gave them an allowance, they would put it in envelopes labeled give, save, gifts, spend, and so on. He says, I thought it was working until one day I had a Band-Aid on my arm, and my daughter, who at that time was about 6 years old, asked, why the Band-Aid? And I explained that I had gotten a medical exam that day in order to get insurance. She asked, what is insurance? I explained, well, Daddy loves you so much, loves the family so much, that if anything were to ever happen to Daddy, which of course it won't, but if it would provide $250,000. He says her eyes got really wide, and she explains that she has a tender heart, and he knew that she would be worried. He says she looked up at me and she said, a piece? I'm not sure, he says, I'm not sure that I taught her the right lessons. I'm not sure that it's really getting through. Money, material things. They have a lure, they have an attractiveness and a pull in our lives that God calls us as we come into relationship with Him through Christ. God calls us to address and to bring in line with His kingdom values. How easy it is, particularly in such a materialistic culture, like the culture we live in, how easy it is to be drawn in, even as Christians, to a lifestyle and pursuit that puts material things at a place of high priority, even a place of worship. We can begin to put our trust, find our security in material things and wealth instead of the one who alone is worthy of our faith and trust. Jesus speaks clearly to us in the Sermon on the Mount on these matters. He tells us, and we've mentioned this for the last number of weeks, he tells us how to build our lives on solid rock, a firm foundation. We've been reminding ourselves through this series of the words of Jesus. At the close of this sermon, in the end of chapter 7, Jesus says that the one who hears these words of mine and then puts them into practice is like the wise man who builds his house on the rock. When the rains come, when the troubles come, the house will stand firm. If you're watching on YouTube, I'll ask you to perhaps pause for a moment here, take a little bit of time to read Matthew chapter 6, verses 19 to 34. Matthew chapter 6, verses 19 to 34. We've done that already in the live Zoom service, but take a moment if you haven't read it or heard it yet. Also, if you have a few more minutes, take a listen to a new song by the group Shane and Shane, a song called Psalm 90. It's a song that really has touched my heart this week as I've listened to it numerous times. Hopefully there's a link for that on YouTube, but a quick Google search will find that for you. Again, Shane and Shane, Psalm 90. And again, if you're watching on a live Zoom, you've already heard that song. And I chose it to share today because the repeated chorus caught my ear as I was listening to it in the background preparing for this talk. When the sun comes up, the chorus goes. When the sun comes up, satisfy us, Lord, before the day has passed us by. Before our hearts forget all your goodness, satisfy us with your love. At first listen to those words. They may sound selfish or self-centered. Lord, satisfy us. But I really believe they are God-honoring words and display a trust in God's provision on the part of the psalmist, and a trust that I want to demonstrate in my life. Psalm 90 is powerful. It's not an easy psalm. In it, the psalmist recognizes the brevity of life and the reality of suffering in life. But in the midst of all of that, the psalmist cries out for God to satisfy the need of his heart and life. God's people, including us, repeatedly turn to idols, material things. We turn from the God where we were created to know and love and worship, and prefer instead to trust ourselves and our own provision. That's why they were experiencing judgment in Psalm 90. And so the psalmist cries out a prayer that demonstrates his faith in God who can meet his every need. Shane and Shane song points us to how God ultimately meets our need day by day when we trust in him. In fact, he satisfies the deepest desires of our heart and meets our real need, in particular through the death and resurrection of his Son, our deepest need for grace and forgiveness. Listening to that song, I found myself asking God to help me have that kind of trust day by day. When the sun comes up, Lord, each new day, before I get caught up in worldly things, temptation to trust in the things of this world instead of in you, before I'm tempted to worship gods of my own making, before I forget your goodness, God, your steadfast love, Lord, satisfy me with your love. As Jesus so often does in the teachings we find here in the Sermon on the Mount, he moves from the negative to the positive. We see it with giving to the needy, with prayer, with fasting, 3 topics we've looked recently at. Don't do it this way, like the hypocrites do. Instead, do it this way. Give in secret. Don't even let your right hand know what your left hand is doing. Make your prayers between you and God. Here too, when it comes to the battle between trusting God or money, or mammon, or material things, however you want to put that, we move back and forth a bit, but generally from negative to the positive. Don't do this, and here's why. Then do this, and here's why. Before we look at that, moving from negative to positive, let's just acknowledge together in real life what happens when we put our trust in material things. The movement of this passage reveals it. If our attention, our concern is always on what clothes we're wearing, the size of our bank account, the amount of trips we get to enjoy, the amount of toys we have for our enjoyment, especially compared to what our neighbor has or the person on that commercial has, if these are the things we look to for security, meaning, and purpose, not only are they temporary and incredibly unsatisfying in the end, but we are consumed with what? We're consumed with worry. How do I get more? How do I get enough money to maintain the things I already have? Will I have enough? Not just for today, but for tomorrow, for 10 years down the line. It makes sense that Jesus moves from saying that you can't serve both God and money to a discussion on worry. And so we move from the negative to the positive. Listen to the do nots in this passage. And let's really listen to the do nots. The wise person listens and then puts it into practice. Let's listen first to the do nots and connected to that to the why nots. Let's move through the passage. Verse 19, do not store up treasures for yourself on earth. Let's ask ourselves honestly whether we need to hear that. Why not store up treasures for yourself on earth? Well, Jesus says they're temporary. They rot away. They get stolen. They don't last. They don't ultimately satisfy or meet our deepest need. Verse 24, another do not. Don't try to serve two masters, God and money. A particular warning to our culture. Don't try to serve two masters, God and money. Why not? You can't do it. To love and serve money is to not love and worship God. You may think you can do both. Many, in fact, are trying, but it's impossible. If you love one, you will hate the other. So there's a surrender here. There's a surrender here of our love for material things. A confession for sure, but also surrender of our attachment to material things. Verse 25, do not worry about your life, what you will eat or drink. Why shouldn't you worry? Because God will take care of you when you trust in him, when you put him first. Look how he cares for the birds and the flowers. It would be wrong to interpret this as meaning that you just sit back and wait for food and clothes to drop into your lap. Commentators suggest here that even the birds are resourceful. Even the flowers have systems to maintain themselves. Photosynthesis, there are processes and work to be done. No, Jesus is pointing us here to the priority of trusting him and looking to him for our needs. As he provides beautifully for the birds and flowers, so he will provide for us. As with so much of this Sermon on the Mount, Jesus is calling us to look not on the surface, but to look at our hearts, to examine the inward reality of what or who comes first. Who do we trust? Who is center in our lives day by day, week by week? Excessive worry can be a strong indicator of that. What comes first? Who do we worship? Why shouldn't we worry? Because God is our provider. Because we can't add any time to our life by worrying. In fact, Jesus doesn't say it here, but we know that it's true that you can actually take a lot of time off your life by worrying. Through this passage, Jesus doesn't just highlight the do nots. He points us to the do's. And basically, there is one main encouragement expressed in a few different ways in these verses. Verse 20 of chapter 6. Do store up for yourself treasures in heaven. Why? They are lasting and truly valuable. Moths and rust cannot destroy them. Verse 33 of chapter 6. Similar, different words. Seek first. Hear the priority. Seek first, above all else, seek first the kingdom of God and his righteousness. Why? It's lasting. It satisfies when you put that first. And other things will find their right place in our lives. All these other things will be added unto you. Is food important? Are clothes important? Is wise use of money important? Is responsible financial planning important? Yes, but none of them are ever meant to be our hope and our stay. Never meant to be our central or come first worship in our lives. Let's listen to the words of Jesus. And if we find need in our hearts or the realities of our daily lives, let's ask him to help us put his word into action. Confession, recommitment to his priority, our worship of him, our worship of Jesus, our worship of the Lord our God. Why don't you just pray with me right now? Let's take a few moments and pray together as we finish our time on this day. Lord, forgive our idolatry. When we have worshiped the created or the material over the creator or the God of all, over you, Lord, forgive us. Satisfy us, Lord, before the day has passed, even this day, before our hearts forget all your goodness. Satisfy us with your love. Amen.